Hi everyone. I look at some cellar operations today, primarily the documentation and standard operating procedures that you need to undertake as a winery business owner. First things we're going to look at in this lecture is the required documentation for a winery premises. There are a lot of things you need to document. I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but if you do own a winery, you do need to have a documentation and a standard operating procedure for your fruit receival, or on top of that, transport to the winery. How are you doing that? You need to have a report of all of your crush operations, what happened, when it happened, what was added, when it was added, and how that fruit was processed. And then the other thing you need to have is a fermentation monitoring document. So something that's showing that you are actively monitoring the fermentation process. The one thing that's always sort of exempted wine from regulation from the food industry is that all of the microbes are destroyed that are harmful to human health in wine during that fermentation process. So that's really important that we have that, and you have proof that you've monitored the fermentation and shown that that's happened. You've created alcohol in the process. You have to record any additions. I'll get a little more detail on that. Anytime you rack, transfer, or move the wine, you need to keep track of that. And also, whenever you lose wine, anything like that, that all needs to be documented. And you've got to write it down. And the Tax Trade Bureau is particularly interested in looking at that. And then another thing that you have to do now is the sanitation piece, which is thanks to the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, which we'll talk about in the HACCP lecture. And we've already gone over sanitation before, so it's something you should be acutely aware of. If you'd like me to record that lecture again, I'll be happy to throw it up. So documentation. A company, especially a winery, is required to have traceable written record of all of its processes and checks. The FDA's policy is if it isn't written down, it doesn't exist. If it isn't written down, it never happened. So if you can't prove that you cleaned a tank, you didn't write it down, they can come down on you. And we're very fortunate that we don't have that level of oversight, but it won't be long before it comes. I think we've been pretty fortunate for a while, but we're going to see wineries have to start complying at a much higher level with this type of documentation. And so we have to show that a product was made and tested correctly. That means you're going to have SOPs for all of your lab analyses, showing that you're running standards on a regular basis. And lab analysis is going to get a little bit more difficult for small wineries that want to do things in-house, because you're going to have to show that your piece of equipment is continuously giving you the right reading. And then you also have to train all the personnel on the grounds of your winery property that work there on those standard operating procedures that you create. And then you also should probably keep logs that all of your equipment's operating correctly, so that your distimmer's doing what it's supposed to do when it's doing it, keeping checklists of the fruit coming in, that the bin dumper's dumping properly, the fruit's going through the must pump properly, that there's no broken parts, and that there's no possibility of cross-contamination from some other entity. So generally, having a checklist, a pre-crush checklist, is a good idea of all of your equipment, and show on a day-to-day basis that everything was operating properly. And we do have that at College Cellars. I just generally do it in the morning before we get rolling every day. I'll be happy to share that with you. So types of documents, we have a few different things. The contemporaneous capture of data events, so batch records, we do that. You guys are used to that. So if you were the 18 Stan Clark cab saw, it'd be the 18 SCCS, that's a batch record. Test records, we want to have lots of those. Fortunately, because we use ETS, we are very lucky that we have a huge pile of test records. So we can keep that on hand in case anybody ever comes in and wants to know what was done to, what condition a wine was in at any state of its life. So we're very fortunate to have that. And then another thing we have is a cleaning log. That's a new thing thanks to the Food Safety Modernization Act. You have to have. You also need to make sure that your buckets that you wash out of are labeled with the agent that you have in there. So you need to have sodium percarbonate, the label from the manufacturer on that bucket. And if you're using like peracetic acid or purasan, make sure that that is also attached or affixed to the bucket. You have to have a log of training. You have to show that you're training everyone that's on site. Fortunately, that's what we do. And so you all are trained, which is kind of nice. It makes my life pretty easy. But if you're running a winery, you need to make sure that every single person is trained up on all your standard operating procedures. And then you may want to have a sample submission form. And again, this is something that we sort of have. So when we have a sample that goes to the lab, that you show when it was sent. And in a reasonable way, just our to-do list is that, because it shows retrospectively when we ordered those samples to be sent to the lab. But most importantly, we have to have a few SOPs. And the really important ones, thanks to FSMA, are cleaning SOPs, SOPs on how to run your equipment, and some SOPs maybe on how you manufacture, like how do you crush, how do you use a muss pump. Then you need to have some QC parameters. So when are you sampling? What are your sampling protocols? So you'll want an SOP for fruit sampling. You'll want a SOP for pre-bottling specifications, anything like that. And then you also maybe will want to have one for if there's a reason for change, why did you deviate from that? So, but the primary ones are facility cleaning, equipment checklists, your manufacturing processes, and quality control. Those are the main ones you've got to have SOPs for. So our documentation, we do have a receipt of fruit log. You will notice that we filled those out, that we have a piece of paper that denotes the date, the time, location of grower, and how much fruit came in. That's the bare minimum. We have a fruit receival log. Then we have our production logs that are numbered. You guys are very familiar with this. They have to be coded by vineyard. They're coded by variety. We have to have our basic chemistry and additions on there. But right now, we're not subject to sanitation logs 100% yet, but I would tend to think we should be doing that. So I would make sure that that's going to be on our agenda from here on out, that anytime that you will add a line to our Google Docs that'll say, what bin did you go in? What was the procedure that you used to clean the bin or the tank beforehand? So was it steam? Was it, peracetic acid? Was it, what was the procedure? And then you'll write the SOP number in that log. It was done per Tim Donahue on X time per SOP, tank sanitation. And then the other documentation we have to have is we've got to record our bulk wine. I keep it in an Excel file. That's the way I track it. We are going to go to Innovant starting this next year. So we're going to move to winery software. And so that's important because I think it's just the way of the future. We've got to start to track a better job, do a better job of tracking. And most importantly, we want to keep alcohol level of every lot. Right now, we're in that sweet spot where it's up to 16% alcohol. So very few of our wines are above that. I think the only thing we have at that level and had in a while has been, fortified wines and a Zinfandel that got up in the 16s. But for the most part, everything is under 16%. And then once a month, I work with Danielle to report on the 5120, and that's a report of winery operations. How much wine do we have on hand? How much has been bottled or moved or lost or topped or whatever? And that's just a general upkeep, and that's something that you have to really do once a month to stay on top of it. Smaller wineries only have to do it once a year, but trust me on this, even when I was running a small winery where I reported once a year, you have to do it once a month. If you do it once a year, it is an absolute disaster. Keep up with it once a month. It is so much easier. It just takes you a little bit of time to do it once a month. It takes me maybe an hour once a month, but if I wait a whole year, it ends up being quite a fiasco. So it's been a really nice thing to be able to do it monthly. It makes it much, much easier. Um, so your receiving report has to cover a few different things. It has to have your raw grapes have to be recorded, tonnage, location, vineyard, and method of transport. And then you need to have a receiving port and a certificate of analysis to give for quality control. So for us, again, this is really easy. You bring it in and you send it off and have an independent lab run it. And that alleviates the headache of making sure that you're keeping all of your records uh, in a standardized form in your own lab. So that's the way we do it. Again, this isn't required by law yet, but as the FDA has been coming more into wineries, I'm hearing that they're asking for this, that you have really documented analysis on the condition of the fruit as it comes in beforehand to make sure that people can't get sick from it, which no one ever has, but nonetheless, it seems to be the way that things are going. Other things we look at are material specification sheets. So these are things used in larger wineries, but we like to see that what I'd love to do is take you out on big tours, but a lot of big wineries have these things called gondolas. And what happens is a truck shows up with machine harvested fruit and an arm shoots out and it augers up a little bit and automatically does a Brix and TA and pH check right at the second the truck shows up. And then the winemaker can decide if they want to take that fruit on, or if the numbers are really bad, they can reject the fruit on the spot because it hasn't technically entered the winery yet. So that's something some people do. But we have to do that on the front end. You have to have raw material specification sheet of what was coming in on the fruit. And then we have to have a final product specification sheet, which we'll go over more in 205. But and you're well aware of how to do all this, but it describes the attributes of your final product. And I mean, I think realistically, bare minimum, pH, TA, free and total sulfur, volume, ethanol, and whether or not this is a bottle sterile product. And the more I'm in the wine industry, it just gets really easy to be able to sterile filter wine. It helps you sleep at night. It's pretty amazing what starts to grow in wine. And again, we'll talk about that in EV 205, but I've been shocked at some of the wines we've gone to bottle with what shows up a couple of years down the road and what starts to grow in some of these higher pH wines. It's been pretty eye-opening for me. So also we have to have batch and test records. These are the essential components. So you've got to have a title, you've got to have your lot or batch number, and then a page number on every tab. Another thing is the FDA really likes is they like to have just written paper workbooks that you write all this down in. So the essential components are that you have a page number on every page or tab, and that you record all of your additions, that anything you add, whatever it is, water, sugar, acid, copper. You also need to make sure there's a reference code on that. Again, you guys are used to doing this. This isn't much of a surprise, but it is really interesting to me that I feel like we run a fairly loose ship here at College Cellars, but compared to a number of the smaller wineries I've been at, it's been kind of eye-opening. And we as an industry have to get better, because if we keep staying this loose, the FDA is going to start to get suspicious, and then we're all going to be in big trouble. So we really got to bring our game up. So other things that we have to do for our test records and components, we have to have a procedure. So what are you going to do in your SOP to make sure it's being done? And you do it in chronological order. So if we were talking about barrel sampling, first thing you do, spray the outside of the barrel with ethanol. Next thing you do, remove the bung. Third thing you do, pull the sample. Fourth thing you do, top barrel. Fifth thing you do, spray down with ethanol again. Sixth thing you do, put bung back in. Seventh thing you do, send wine to lab for QC. And an SOP is really that simple. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. Just make sure that everything is really, really, really simple, really, really straightforward, and that it's easy to read and easy to sign off. And some of the SOPs I've seen are just so ridiculously simple, but you just got to have them, and everybody has to read them. And this is just the culture that you have in your winery. Other things we have to do is label information. And then, of course, how are we storing things? Where are we storing it? So how many barrels do we have? What are the size of the barrels? And what room are they in? What are the temperatures of those rooms? Again, probably a little bit more towards, produce and raw vegetable type things that the FDA looks at. But realistically, we should be trying to do our best to follow their lead. So SOPs are just some sort of documented process control. Again, equipment use, like before you get on a forklift, you check off all the boxes. Before the destimmer runs, you check to make sure that everything's working, that there's no loose parts. And then you want to write down when the last time all that equipment was serviced. Not a bad idea just to keep the receipts on hand so that if you have somebody come out and work on it, you can say, hey, I had XYZ company work on our destimmer. In our case, KLR Machines comes out and they'll do all the work to make sure our destimmer's up and running. And then who is responsible for what? So maybe if you're running a bigger custom crush facility, there's a team that's responsible for sanitation. Maybe there's a team that's responsible for quality control, some things like that. But most importantly, when you're writing an SOP, the first SOP you write is a procedure for writing SOPs. As crazy as that sounds. And so it should talk about the format of what the SOP should look like, so you have a cohesive look throughout your entire business. And then who's responsible for writing, numbering, and approving, and distributing, and controlling, and revising, and archiving SOPs. And in this case, it's me. But I'm going to have all of you be responsible for writing, numbering these new ones and reviewing them. Maybe you'll decide that some of the students have done not a very good job previously, and you guys get an update. So I've assigned you all some SOPs to update and bring me a revision on. So what's in an SOP? First thing you do is you have a header. Who are you? Title. What's the document number? Is there a revision number? Does it replace an older one? And if it does, which one does it replace? And then a date that is in effect. And then it has to have, page numbers on it. So you can say, go to page number XYZ of the SOP. Purpose and scope, what it's about, who it applies to, definitions and principle, who's in charge, why are we doing this? And then who is the technician that's got to follow the procedure, who's supervising it, who's the manager, and who's the quality control analysis person. In a small winery, this might be one person. So, it may not necessarily have to go this far, but they will want it for bigger wineries. They'll have them very, very specifically laid out. The other things we want to talk about in SOPs is maybe we want to talk about effective concentrations. So again, in bigger food safe wineries, they'll be regularly measuring the concentration of their peracetic acid. They'll be regularly measuring the concentration of their caustic soda to show that they've got strong enough concentrations for the cleaning process. Then they might want to be checking to see if things are sterile. They want to talk about who the vendor or supplier is. And then if you run out of Purisan, which is one brand of peracetic acid, is there another brand you can go to for your cleaning? So there's other things you can do in your SOPs is sometimes one SOP will reference another SOP. So maybe what you'll say is like in fruit crushing, you'll say first thing will be check bin dumper operations per bin dumper SOP, check destimmer operations per destimmer SOP, check must pump operations for must pump SOP, and then finally you then ensure tank is clean per tank cleaning SOP, and then once those things are all checked, then you can go ahead and run your fruit. Then you might want to talk about forms or literature that are appropriate for those things, for what you're doing, if there's something that backs up why you're doing that SOP. And another thing they like is MSDS sheets. So maybe if you're talking about cleaning, attached to the back of the SOP, your sodium percarbonate label and your peracetic acid label. Again, cleaning is an easy one to go back to, and that's the one we're going to have to beat over the head because that is really is the one new thing that is required. And then you may want to have equipment manuals. So if you are doing forklift training, things like that. Those manuals are available to back up the reason you're doing the checks you're checking. So your content has to be step by step. Use specific numbers only if required. They really just like broad ranges. And use an active voice. So you do this thing, not, the tray is washed, you say wash the tray. Include what to record and where to record it, and what to do if something doesn't work and who to talk to. But basically, at the end of the day, what should reflect what is done, not how it should be done. So in the FDA's view, it's much worse to not follow a great written procedure than to follow a procedure that can be improved. So just use, make a great written procedure that's easy to use. Again, it has to be easy to use. I cannot stress this enough. SOPs are a good idea for production wineries. We should all be doing this. Currently, SOPs are only required for sanitation, but realistically, if you have a group of standard operating procedure, an FDA inspector shows up and you pull out your folder or open up your Google Doc, Drive Doc, or your laminated folder that says that these are all of our SOPs that we use, and you show that you're being active and actually proactive in making sure that your winery has some standard operating procedures, that will go a long way towards them building trust with you that you're doing the right thing, because then they know that what you're doing has been thought out. And then documentation proves what you have done and what it said. Without documentation, there's nothing there to back up what actually happened. So you are required to have a traceable written record of all processes and checks. If it isn't written down, it doesn't exist. If it isn't written down, it never happened. So they'd come in and say, did you clean the tank? Yeah, I cleaned the tank. Where's it written down? Well, I didn't write it down. Well, then you didn't clean the tank. Check, violation. That simple. So if we do get to the point where we get real big, heavy FDA audits, be ready for it.